Welcome to another broadcast from mindsyourhealthcast.com. You're either pretty persistent or you've been totally bored to death and quit a long time ago, and maybe you've come back to see if maybe it's gotten any better. However, we're going to continue on for the better or the worse to give you all kinds of information, some of which you may agree, some of which you may wonder about, and some of which you may say, it's all hooey. Anyhow, the subject I've chosen for today is one that I've been engaged with, I guess, my whole adult life, and that has to do with something called energy. Now, the term is thrown around all over the place and walked on and splattered on the wall and attached to just about anything and everything you can think of, and probably because it's not a simple subject to discuss, because it has many aspects. I guess my entry into the therapeutic field came via the energetic side, and therefore it's never been a big issue with me because I have been well aware of what it is, what it does, how it works in many respects. There, of course, are aspects of it that remain a mystery yet, and in this first broadcast, we probably won't get too far except to lay some foundation. I'm guessing this, especially since we've shortened our broadcast, is a minimum of 2, but more likely 3 broadcasts because of the width of the subject. There's nothing much that we can look at or experience in this world that somehow does not involve energy. Now, as I say, it's a very difficult term to define today, much more so than it was when I was young and taking my first physics class in school. Energy was under the realm of physics, and the definition was pretty simple. Energy is the capacity to do work. Pretty straightforward. And what that meant is energy, which in some way was a force acting on matter, caused something to happen. So it could cause the energy produced by a horse pulling a wagon loaded with material to be transported from one place to another involves simple physics of energy and work. You could calculate to a degree back then, not like you can now, how much energy was being expended. In fact, one of the terms of energy has to do with horsepower, and that's been a standard for a long time. People still toss it about when they're purchasing an automobile, although in recent years, with the other ways of tweaking the production of energy, maybe the horsepower is not as important as torque and other factors that are utilized in determining the power and speed of an engine. At any rate, it was a very simplistic definition and wasn't difficult. But we're looking at it in a very broad sense in this broadcast and the ones to follow. And in fact, it became apparent to me very rapidly that this actually was a book. And of course, we can't do a whole book on the broadcast, or I guess we could, but people probably get so bored before it was ever done. Or something would intervene, so they never would really get through it. So what I want to do is to present an overview and introduce information as well as questions that might provoke you to look forward to investigating on your own, because, as I say, it is a vast subject once you get into it. Now, I'm calling this broadcast Energy, Information, and Life, and because we're going to be making a lot of application to life and health, and therefore it's especially in those areas, very important to have some basic understanding, as much as can be, about the whole concept of energy. Now, when we expand that, if we really want to get into the big picture, it involves a tremendous amount. But interestingly, once you explore all of this and then kind of condense it down to the core, everything is involved with energy. And in some way or other, the movement of energy or the energy moving things, and how that relates to function. And so we're going to do a lot about that, especially as it applies to the body and as it applies to the mind and brain. Enough so that you can understand the importance of it. Now, as I say, my entry into the whole thing came way back, and it, I would say, pushing 40 years ago. Maybe longer than that, because I really became interested in energy and electronics and so forth in my teens. I was working on radios, building radios, understanding how radio information is transmitted through the air and received and decoded so that now you have the sound of voice or music. In my early days, there was no TV, of course. And so it was a much simpler field because of the fact we didn't have the intervention of quantum physics and a lot of other things that would make a big difference. But at the time, what was available, I availed myself of and learned to utilize what my knowledge was of it. And of course I learned electronics back in the vacuum tube days originally, and at the end of some of the studies I was doing in my late teens was when the first solid state transistors came into being. So I studied all the old vacuum tubes, that had all the different elements in the vacuum tube and how you applied voltages to those and could utilize those as a method of controlling, modulating, amplifying, and in some cases turning off the movement of information through circuits. And that was the vacuum tube. And the vacuum tube was extremely interesting to me, how all those little elements inside that connected to the different prongs on the vacuum tube and different voltages applied to each of those regulated the movement of electrons through the tube, hence energy. And it was quite fascinating. But as I say, pretty rapidly once the transistor was introduced, things changed. And then later when we developed the IC chip, where we could put hundreds of components on one tiny chip, and run it at very low voltages and yet do some pretty powerful things, why that kind of changed the whole face of everything. So we want to kind of tune you in, introduce you to some of the areas that have been investigated and some of the material that's available for you to look at. Now, since I was interested in energetics, acupuncture and Chinese medicine came very natural for me to get involved with because of the fact that it basically was talking about energy. That part of it was very, it made sense to me. The movement of electrons, the movement of voltage and amperage and resistance and capacitance and all those things that had to do with electronics actually do apply to the body. And so it was pretty easy to relate to that. It didn't seem so mysterious to me as it did to some people. And then later I was introduced to another aspect of energetics as it relates to the mind-body relationship, and hence the emotional-mental side. And I received that, I've mentioned back along the way, I received that introduction via a psychologist in New York City. I attended a seminar And at that seminar, it was actually on something called hypno-operant therapy. But one of the two psychologists that were putting it on had been to visit a doctor in New Jersey, who at the time, his name was Dr. Dengrove, and he had been introduced to the work of Wilhelm Reich, which had a lot to do with energy, and especially the body energy, and how it relates to health and illness, both physically and emotionally. So it hooked my attention immediately because, as I say, I already was interested in and could relate well to energy and electron movement and so forth. And it became fascinating very rapidly, and I couldn't wait to get back to Cleveland area where I lived at the time and go to my favorite bookstore in Cleveland, which was a mammoth store right in downtown Cleveland, had 2 mammoth floors. The whole upper floor was all used books, and the whole lower floor all new books. And they had so many books, they claimed over 1 million in stock. And I'm sure it's true because I could go there and go to one section and spend the whole day just looking at books in one particular subject. So pretty much anything you wanted to find, I could find. So a couple, 3 of the names that were mentioned at this seminar, one, of course, was Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who originated this whole thing of energies in the body, and especially with mental as well as physical health. And Alexander Lowen, who was a medical doctor, psychiatrist who studied with Reich, and he later felt the term Reich used, which was orgone energy, which really meant organic energy. He thought that the term orgone was rather nebulous and people couldn't relate to it so well. And so he ended up coining the term bioenergetics. And that is today, the system is more remembered as bioenergetics. So Lowen had several books out at that point. So when I came back from New York, I went to the bookstore and I found several books by Lowen and one by another psychiatrist in New York who continued to use the system that was taught by Reich. His name was Dr. Ellsworth Baker, who was a psychiatrist that kept the term orgone therapy. And so anyhow, it continued to grow over the years, and it still have practitioners that utilize it, except that today there's a tremendous amount of information known about energetics that was not known back then. More subtle equipment to measure energetics. The sophistication of electronics has ushered in the ability to verify that there are these energies. And then later in this, not today, but we'll be getting to the work of Dr. William Tiller, and you will get into the realm of the application of quantum physics as it relates to energy and reality and our bodies and health and sickness and the mind and etc. So this should prove to be a very interesting journey. Now, at the beginning, I want to present, it's kind of coincidental and kind of triggered my thinking about bringing this up as a subject. Now, I have talked before about certain aspects of it, but as far as I know, I have never brought it all together in terms of energetics in general, the application of quantum physics to the concept of energetics, the latest research in terms of methods of measuring energy, especially on the subtle level, and you're going to hear that term brought up, subtle energies. Some of the books that are written refer to subtle energies. But it's interesting, I just pulled up a set of cassettes. I spend a tremendous amount of time listening to recordings of various researchers and doctors and theorists and practitioners of various sorts to get ideas and to keep up. And way back in 1998, there was a conference on energy medicine. And so energy medicine will be one of the applications we'll be talking about, and also energy psychology. And the interesting thing, as I say, when you really get down to it, it all comes together. It all interacts or interrelates. And if once you get the basic picture, it's interesting how all the pieces kind of fall into place. And so instead of being all these separate little factions that you hear about, there is a commonality, an underlying commonality. And that's what we want to get to. We want to help you kind of understand that. So anyhow, they had this conference on subtle energies, consciousness, and the new science of healing. And so they invited several practitioners around the country and brought it all together, and they made recordings, at least of some of them. This is part of an International Society for the Study of Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine, is an organization that was formed several years ago to understand, make use of, and teach and propagate information related to energy and energy healing. And so this conference, at least a portion of it, was recorded and made available by a company called Sounds True. Now this recording was made in 1998, and as I say, I periodically pull out material from back because it's interesting to see what at the time how you understood it, and as time has moved on and you've learned more, how's your understanding of it compared to what it was at the original period of time? Either you read a book or listened to recordings or whatever. I'm not sure if this is still available, but if it is, it's a very good introduction by several doctors and researchers, and some of my favorites are in here. Dr. Robert O. Becker, which I'm going to mention in a minute, on the body, electric, biomagnetic, and energy medicine. In other words, he's talking about that whole interrelationship. He's a researcher, was out of New York, and with one of the big veterans hospitals, he was doing a tremendous amount of research in terms of electricity and energy in the body, wrote several books, and I'm going to recommend one of them in a moment, but any of his books are good. There's one that's extremely technical, you may not want. It's not only technical but expensive, on the mechanisms of healing, and that's what he actually started his research in, was what's involved when the body is injured and it heals that injury. And through all of that, it introduced him to bioenergetics, the application of energy to biological systems. And he wrote, over time, some very interesting books, and one of the key ones, which I'll mention today, is one that you should accumulate in your library if you have an interest in really learning more about it. Now, you could contact the company called Sounds True. If you Google it, they're out of Boulder, Colorado, and they put out a lot of recordings of what I call interesting, unusual, more forward type of material. A lot of things on meditation, a lot of things on energetics, healing, methods of healing, theories of healing, a lot of the psychological, mental types of things. But this particular conference is a really good introduction to some of the thinking of some of the pioneers. Now, another person that is extremely good in the set is John Upledger, who's a DO, a doctor of osteopathy, developed a lot of work related to the brain and spinal cord and how energy moves in the body, and he was one of the originators of a concept called an energy cyst in the body, which is toxic energy that comes together and actually affects the physical matter of the body. A lot of things, and he introduced cranial therapy, helping to free up the movement of the brain spinal fluid. and its movement back and forth and the importance of it, and has done a lot of things. He formed something called the Upledger Institute, which is actually here in Florida, and I have been to one of his programs before on the system. And another extremely good person in terms of information is Dr. Elmer Green, who is a PhD researcher. Was out of the Topeka, Kansas Menninger Clinic for years. He and his wife, Elise, they did a tremendous amount of research on energies and health and healing, biofeedback, you name it, investigating Native American healers, pretty much anything in that realm. And Beverly Rubik, I've met before. She is a PhD, and her topic here was subtle information in healing. She has continued on. She was with Temple University for a long time, and I think now she has an independent setup where she does a lot of research and writing. And she's kind of written a lot of information on energetic healing and the scientific information behind it. She's one of the few people, and a female, I should say, with a PhD in science. So that tells you something about her intellectual level. I think that her material is always good if you can run into any of it. And there's others on here, Larry Dassey, who's an MD, and he's written many, many books. In this particular one, he talked about consciousness, energy, and healing. So you would find, it's just a good introduction from some different directions, both on man as a whole and man as an individual. Charles Tart, I have several of his books. He's a PhD, again, researcher, and his subject was on exploring our fears of the paranormal, which again, we're talking about some type of energy movement transfer, information transfer, and several others. Willis Harmon, PhD, he became the head of Noetic Institute back along the way. That was established by one of the astronauts. That the purpose of it was to investigate man and his lot, period, the effect of consciousness on man, life, and so forth. And he brought together a lot of the people who were doing research from around the world. Now, of course, we don't have time to talk about every one of them, or we could be talking, like I said, it ended up, as I looked more into this, that we're talking really a book. And so maybe if I can find the time, I might consider doing something. Now, I'm going to give you a couple other books that I think is very important. This one has gone through more than one edition, called Vibrational Medicine, the #1 handbook of subtle energy therapies. Now, there again is that subtle energy. And Richard Gerber has done a tremendous amount of research, and he has been quoted around the world. He gives you a good bit of background of all the various things that fall under that realm of vibrational medicine. Now, remember, vibration has to do with frequency or waves and so forth. And so I've seen him being quoted by books out of Great Britain, Germany, and all over, because he did a tremendous job. This is the 3rd edition here. So as I say, it's been through several editions. Very good book to get if you want a basic understanding. One of the 2 books that I have mentioned over and over, by now you should have it in your library. If you haven't, shame on you. It's got a tremendous amount of information, called Energy Medicine, The Scientific Basis, by James Oshman, and has a foreword by Candace Pert, who did all the research on molecules of emotion, how the body becomes the storage vessel of all the memories that they're scattered through all of the cells of the body. Very good material, but this man has, he's a researcher, a PhD researcher to begin with. Interestingly, in traditional medicine, the standard medicine of the day has argued over and over there's no research to verify any of this stuff, which means all the energetic approaches, whether it be acupuncture or other types of energetic healing. And so Oshman set out to just review the literature of the research that has been done over the years. And he came up with thousands of studies that, when you bring them together, verify all the various aspects of what is being done in energy medicine. And so you will find this to be a very good book to get into, and it will give you a lot of good information on, I don't care whether it's Dolores Krieger, the nurse who did the healing touch, where the nurses, it was found that people that had a lot of health problems, that sometimes just the nurse touching them with the intent of improving their condition had big effects on the person in terms of either symptoms or of actually improving in the health condition. So he has the scientific rationale and the resources. He gives you all the quotations. Now this is one book, a lot of illustrations, so you can get the concept in your head. The other book is called Energy Medicine and Therapeutics in Human Performance, which also has a tremendous amount of information. So I think either this one or the other one, he's in the process and either has or will be releasing a new revised version, meaning he's added more to it. But this is a must-have, these two books. If you had no other books that I'm talking about that would pretty much at some point touch on the things I'll be talking about, these two books would be the ones to have. Dr. Becker, remember I mentioned it just a few moments ago, who is the MD researcher at the Veterans Hospital in New York, who did all the work on healing to begin with. This got him started. What is the mechanism of healing in the body? If you get a cut, what goes on to heal the cut? And in studying that whole process, he learned about how the body works. And so apart from the very first big technical book he wrote and a lot of the technical material, he later came out with one called The Body Electric. It's electromagnetism and the foundation of life. Again, his name is Robert Becker. This book has a tremendous amount of information, verified a lot of things that people who were in the natural realm of healing said and practiced, but he's got the documentation, the scientific documentation. Just to give you one fast example, see, I'm really wanting to get you into a real big understanding of this whole process. Now, whether you agree with it or not, that's up to you, but at least you'll understand the scientific basis and the rationale behind it, that it's not some whim out of a closet somewhere, but it actually is factual, verifiable, and the studies have been done. You just don't hear about it because, getting back to what we've talked about before, the more of this that is brought into play, the less drugs people take, and the less drugs people take, the more it cuts the profits and sales of certain interests in this world that are making a fortune off of people's misfortune. And so, and again, I don't have any qualms with somebody making money off of helping someone if, number one, the money they're making is reasonable, and number two, if they're really helping someone. But in my opinion, when you give somebody something that covers symptoms but does nothing for the problem and allows your body to get worse, knowing you'll be back later to get more expensive treatment for a more serious problem, I think that's an exploitation, and I'm hoping that you have been alerted enough to start investigating on your own. But this is a tremendous book. He has some others out that are readable by the average person. You don't have to be a physicist. Now, one I don't have here, but it's extremely important because of the fact we're talking about health, and that is a book by a physicist who is, his name is Fred Alan Wolf, and he's written a large number of books. He's an interesting guy because many years ago he was a straight quantum physicist, and at the very least and probably agnostic. Anyhow, things started happening. You know, quantum physics has a way of awakening your mind to expand it tremendously. And we'll talk about it a little bit more, because you can't talk about body and body energetics without talking a bit about quantum physics. So Fred Alan Wolf, many years ago, was on the best-selling list when the very first book that I know he wrote for the public was called Taking the Quantum Leap. I've mentioned that book before, and if you want to get your mind whetted to understanding a little bit about quantum physics without mathematics, it was a book for the public. It was on the #1 book-selling list at one point, and it gets you thinking a little bit of a different way. Not bad, but expanded. And so he wrote a whole series of books after that first one. The public really enjoyed it, and whether they agreed with it or not, they enjoyed being introduced to quantum physics in a way that was understandable. And then he followed that up with one called Star Wave, which had to do with quantum physics and the mind. And then he followed that up with one called Parallel Universes, based on a concept that we won't even get into now, but it intrigued him, so he wrote one whole book on it, because he mentions it earlier in the Quantum Leap book, but this expands a bit on it. And then he wrote one called The Body Quantum. Now, I'm saying all that to get to that book, because The Body Quantum is when he talked about how functions of the body operate in accordance with quantum physics principles, in particular the nervous system and the DNA, the secret code that we just had been talking about recently. And so you will find some of the principles that we'll be talking about is our intervention in DNA. He talked about this years ago. Now, he went on to write several other books because he took a sabbatical leave from teaching, traveled around the world, visited shamans and healers and all kinds of things, came back and started a whole new trend of books. And so you would want to come down to some of his later books, like Mind into Matter, which some of the things we will make mention of, he elaborates on. One called The Spiritual Universe, the Scientific Proof for the Existence of the Soul, and a lot of other things that he's written that you will find fascinating. Took a big turn, I think, his sabbatical and going out and really seeing the world outside the academic atmosphere allowed him to expand his thinking, because what he saw, he knew was there that he had not been aware of before, and in order to incorporate what he saw into what he knew, it expanded his thinking. So yeah, I think it changed the books tremendously. There's a couple others. I just threw this in. It's called Biotherapy, A Healing for the 21st Century, the Eastern European Method of Energy Balancing that Anyone Can Master. I'm giving you those because we're seeing the word energy thrown all over the place and applied to a lot of things, and so these will give you some different introductions. This one's called Health by Bioenergy and Mind, getting back again to energy. Another one by a medical doctor in this country, or actually out of Canada, called Human Energy Fields. You would find this fascinating, some of the aspects he talks about. And of course, the one that we talked about last time and before, we've talked about The Basic Code of the Universe, The Science of the Invisible in Physics, Medicine, and Spirituality, Dr. Citro out of Italy, his research group. Some of the things we'll be talking about are in here. I think if you haven't purchased Citro's book yet, The Basic Code of the Universe, I would put that one along with The Body Electric and with Vibrational Medicine and with the two books by Dr. Oshman as key books to have in your library. Now, there's a lot of others out there that are available, but these, I think, are a good jumping off point to really get you tuned in. And to me, this is extremely important. Um, this points out how limited modern medicine is. Now, I'm not saying that anything and everything they do is bad or wrong. I think the surgical area of medicine and the emergency medicine has developed tremendously, but as soon as that's done, you get out and you get your body in good shape, and it takes a lot of other things to do that. Otherwise, I think you'd have to be blind if you didn't say that our health is worse today than ever. More people are sick with more serious things, and not only that, it's happening earlier and earlier. So I'm giving you all this information because I want you to know that there are options and where to find information about it, and if you are scientifically inclined, where to find the scientific documentation, that it's not as off the wall as you're led to believe, because you realize that these people have a vested interest in you not knowing nor being concerned about anything that would take you away from modern pharmacological therapies. And this information is tremendous. It's from all over the world. Some other things I'll be talking about, and I have talked about, like Citro is out of Italy. There's a huge group of medical doctors that formed this research organization. They're beginning to get a good understanding. Luc Montagnier is now doing some work with them. He's out of France. He's one of the so-called co-discoverers of the HIV idea and AIDS. Published a paper where he says, well, yeah, maybe this does really prove that homeopathic medicine has a scientific basis. Now, that's a lot coming from a big researcher from the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And there's just a lot of things happening out there all over the world. It's not just in the U.S. or some little pocket someplace. I mean, it's popping up all over the world. China, one of the top physicists that's Chinese, Dr. Ho, H.O., has several books written on physics. She's a recognized in the scientific community physicist, tremendous amount of stuff on energetics. She wrote one of her first books that I got was called The Rainbow and the Worm, and the rainbow has to do with colors, and colors have to do with frequencies. So she's talking about life and health and frequency, getting back to what we're talking about now, which all comes under the realm of energy. Out of Russia, tremendous amount of information coming out. We will be mentioning some of the work being done in Russia, and it's everywhere. Great Britain, I mentioned France, down in Australia, tremendous things going on in Australia. So it's not some little local phenomenon or issue. I mean, we're talking about all over the world. So I want to get you enthused and excited about it, at least enough to look into it, even if you don't agree with it. I think you will find it very challenging and provocative to get into what energy is all about. Now, I've kind of laid some foundations today, and I gave you the very simple definition of energy that goes back to my early training in physics. Now we're going to start moving into expanding quite a bit about what this all means, and we want to apply it in two areas. We want to apply it in the area of energetic medicine and energetic psychology, or energy psychology as it's called. And I think when you begin to see how this all comes together to form a picture of the world and how it works, I think you're going to find it very fascinating. Whether you choose to participate in it for yourself, that's up to you. But at least you'll know that it's available, and you'll then know you'll also have a choice. We have expended our time, I see, beyond what we should have, as always. Hopefully I have provoked you enough to want you to come back to the next broadcast, whether we'll get into some more definition of energy and types of energy and what it's all about. And I'm sure that probably everybody is acquainted by now with Einstein's famous equation E equals mc squared. E being energy is equal to the mass, meaning the weight of matter, times the speed of light squared, which is a tremendous constant, a big one. And how much energy is inherent in one little speck of matter. And I don't know how much you've thought about it, but that's what it really gets down to, is that matter and energy are convertible back and forth. And there's another player in the picture that's, of course, not brought up in that equation, but we will talk more about that. And that is some of the work of Dr. William Tiller, who throws another hat in the ring in terms of information and ways of looking at the information. Otherwise, you have a good week and be healthy. Don't forget to go to our health website called mindyourhealth.com, and as I say, there's a link to Alternative Health and Prevention, my office, and also there's many pages of information, of books and other things to improve your health. More often than not, they somehow involve energetics, and once you get all this understanding, it's all going to make sense. It was good being with you again. Until the next broadcast, be healthy.